Chapter 21. The discussion of Mr. Collins's offer was now nearly at an end, and Elizabeth had only to suffer from the uncomfortable feelings necessarily attending it, and occasionally from some peevish allusion of her mother. As for the gentleman himself, his feelings were chiefly expressed not by embarrassment or dejection, or by trying to avoid her, but by stiffness of manner and resentful silence. So he was just not talking to her. He scarcely ever spoke to her, and the assiduous attentions which he had been so sensible of himself were transferred for the rest of the day to Miss Lucas, whose civility in listening to him was a seasonable relief to them all, and especially to her friend. So Charlotte Lucas, Elizabeth's best friend, is there, and he doesn't want to talk to anybody, but he'll talk to her at least. And so they were so grateful that she was there, so he could at least talk to her. The morrow produced no abatement of Mrs. Bennet's ill humor or ill health. Mr. Collins was also in the same state of angry pride. Elizabeth had hoped that his resentment might shorten his visit, but his plan did not appear in the least affected by it. He was always to have gone on Saturday, and to Saturday he meant still to stay. After breakfast, the girls walked to Meryton to inquire if Mr. Wickham were returned, and to lament over his absence from the Netherfield ball. He joined them on their entering the town, and attended them to their aunt's, where his regret and vexation and the concern of everybody was well talked over. To Elizabeth, however, he voluntarily acknowledged that the necessity of his absence had been self-imposed. "I found," said he, as the time drew near, "that I had better not meet Mr. Darcy, that to be in the same room, the same party with him, for so many hours together, might be more than I could bear, and that scenes might arise unpleasant to more than myself." So he's like, I chose not to go to the Netherfield ball because I didn't know what was going to happen. I mean, maybe something was, I don't know, maybe we were going to make a scene there. She highly approved of his forbearance, and they had leisure for a full discussion of it, and for all the commendation which they civilly bestowed on each other, as Wickham and another officer walked back with them to Longbourn, and during the walk he particularly attended to her. His accompanying them was a double advantage. She felt all the compliment it offered to herself, and it was most acceptable as an occasion of introducing him to her father and mother. She's like, "Oh my goodness, he's walking us home. I'm going to introduce him to my mom and my dad." So they had a long walk, and so they were able to speak about everything that happened. Soon after their return, a letter was delivered to Miss Bennet. It came from Netherfield, and was opened immediately. The envelope contained a sheet of elegant little hot-pressed paper, well covered with a lady's fair flowing hand, and Elizabeth saw her sister's countenance change as she read it, and saw her dwelling intently on some particular passages. So there's a letter from Netherfield, which is from the Bingleys' estate, and remember, they're only renting, right? And so her countenance changed, meaning her face changed as she read it. Jane recollected herself soon, and putting the letter away, tried to join with her usual cheerfulness in the general conversation, but Elizabeth felt an anxiety on the subject which drew off her attention even from Wickham, and no sooner had he and his companion taken leave than a glance from Jane invited her to follow her upstairs. When they had gained their own room, Jane, talking out of the letter, said, so Jane's like, "Dude, let me tell you." She's like, "Come over here." So when they were alone, Jane's now going to tell her what's going on. "This is from Caroline Bingley. What it contains has surprised me a good deal. The whole party have left Netherfield by this time, and are on their way to town, and without any intention of coming back again. You shall hear what she says." So everybody's moving away. The Bingleys are gone. They don't live at Netherfield anymore. She then read the first sentence aloud, which comprised the information of their having just resolved to follow their brother to town directly, and of their meaning to dine that day in Grosvenor Street, where Mr. Hurst had a house. The next was in these words: "I do not pretend to regret anything I shall leave in Hertfordshire except your society, my dearest friend, but we will hope at some future period to enjoy many returns to the delightful intercourse we have known, and in the meanwhile may lessen the pain of separation by very frequent and most unreserved correspondence. She's like, oh yeah, I'm leaving, and I'm not sorry for leaving, except for the fact that I'm leaving you. She's like, but we can write letters to each other. I depend on you for that. To these high-flown expressions, Elizabeth listened with all the insensibility of distrust. So Elizabeth's like, yeah, right, I don't trust that girl at all. And though the suddenness of the removal surprised her, she saw nothing in it really to lament. It was not to be supposed that their absence from Netherfield would prevent Mr. Bingley's being there, and as to the loss of their society, she was persuaded that Jane must soon cease to regard it in the enjoyment of his. She's like, yeah, no, I don't. Elizabeth's like, whatever. I'm not worried. I'm pretty sure Mr. Bingley's still going to come calling on Jane. It is unlucky, said she, after a short pause, that you should not be able to see your friends before they leave the country. But may we not hope that the period of future happiness to which Miss Bingley looks forward may arrive earlier than she is aware, and that the delightful intercourse you have known as friends will be renewed with yet greater satisfaction as sisters? Mr. Bingley will not be detained in London by them. So Elizabeth's like, well, maybe y'all will be sisters, like sister-in-law, pretty soon. So maybe you won't be apart that long. Caroline decidedly says that none of the party will return to Hertfordshire this winter. I will read it to you. When my brother left us yesterday, this is part of the letter. When my brother left us yesterday, he imagined that the business which took him to London might be concluded in 3 or 4 days, but as we are certain it cannot be so, and at the same time convinced that when Charles gets to town he will be in a hurry to leave it again, we have determined on following him thither, that he may not be obliged to spend his vacant hours in a comfortless hotel. Many of my acquaintances are already there for the winter. I wish I could hear that you, my dearest friend, had any intention of making one in the crowd, but of that I despair. I sincerely hope your Christmas in Hertfordshire may abound in the gaieties which that season generally brings, and that your beaux will be so numerous as to prevent your feelings the loss of the 3 of whom we shall deprive you. She's like, yeah, no, we're staying for the winter. My brother, he had something to do. We just followed him there. We just feel like, we're going to end up staying, and it'd be great if you were here with us, but you're not. So Merry Christmas, and, have a good life. It is evident by this, added Jane, that he comes back no more this winter. It is only evident that Miss Bingley does not mean that he should. So Elizabeth's like, no, that's not what that means. Miss Bingley doesn't speak for her brother. Maybe he'll come back, but just because she won't doesn't mean he won't. Why will you think so? I mean, it must be his own doing. He is his own master, but you do not know all. I will read you the passage which particularly hurts me. I will have no reserves from you. So this is what the rest of the letter says. Mr. Darcy is impatient to see his sister, and to confess the truth, we are scarcely less eager to meet her again. I really do not think Georgiana Darcy has her equal for beauty, elegance, and accomplishments, and the affection she inspires in Louisa and myself is heightened into something still more interesting from the hope we dare to entertain of her being hereafter our sister. So Caroline Bingley is saying, oh yeah, we're going to go see Darcy's sister, and we hope that she's our sister soon. I mean, how can she be their sister? Unless Mr. Bingley marries her. So is that what she's implying? Maybe so. The letter continues. I do not know whether I have ever before mentioned to you my feelings on this subject, but I will not leave the country without confiding them, and I trust you will not esteem them unreasonable. My brother admires her greatly already. He will have frequent opportunity now of seeing her on the most intimate footing. Her relations all wish the connection as much as his own, and his sister's partiality is not misleading me, I think, when I call Charles most capable of engaging any woman's heart. With all these circumstances to favor an attachment and nothing to prevent it, am I wrong, my dearest Jane, in indulging the hope of an event which will secure the happiness of so many? So she's like, her family wants it, his family wants it, and there's no doubt that he can make her fall in love with him because he's just a cool guy like that. So, it's probably going to happen, just letting you know. "What think you of this sentence, my dear Lizzie?" said Jane as she finished it. "Is it not clear enough? Does it not expressly declare that Caroline neither expects nor wishes me to be her sister, that she is perfectly convinced of her brother's indifference, and that if she suspects the nature of my feelings for him, she means most kindly to put me on my guard? Can there be any other opinion on the subject?" She's like, "No, Caroline's just being nice to me. She's just warning me that he's going to get married to somebody else, and she's just watching out for me." And she's like, could it mean anything else?" And Elizabeth says, "Yes, there can be another meaning, for mine is totally different. Will you hear it?" "Most willingly." "You shall have it in a few words. Miss Bingley sees that her brother is in love with you, and wants him to marry Miss Darcy. She follows him to town in hope of keeping him there, and tries to persuade you that he does not care about you." Jane shook her head. So Elizabeth is basically telling Jane, like, "Hey, no, this is all Miss Bingley. She doesn't want him to marry you, so she followed her brother to try to keep him in London or wherever he's at." I said London. Is it London? Gosh, into town. Anyway, and so she's like, no, she's trying to make you think that he doesn't care for you, but he does. She's like, don't listen to her. Jane shook her head. "Indeed, Jane, you ought to believe me. No one who has ever seen you together can doubt his affection. Miss Bingley, I am sure, cannot. She is not such a simpleton. Could she have seen half as much love in Mr. Darcy for herself, she would have ordered her wedding clothes. But the case is this: we are not rich enough or grand enough for them, and she is the more anxious to get Miss Darcy for her brother from the notion that when there has been one intermarriage, she may have less trouble in achieving a second." So she's like, "Yeah, no, Miss Bingley just wants to marry Darcy herself. So she figures if she gets her brother to marry Darcy's sister, then maybe she'll have a better chance to marry Darcy herself." In which there is certainly some ingenuity, and I dare say it would succeed if Miss de Bourgh were out of the way. She's like, "Yeah, and if Miss de Bourgh really wasn't a thing, because we know that Miss de Bourgh and Mr. Darcy are betrothed, right?" She says, "But my dearest Jane, you cannot seriously imagine that because Miss Bingley tells you her brother greatly admires Miss Darcy, he is in the smallest degree less sensible of your merit than when he took leave of you on Tuesday, or that it will be in her power to persuade him that instead of being in love with you, he is very much in love with her friend." She's like, "No, there's no way. You can't just tell people, hey, you're in love with this girl and not with this girl, and then it be so. No, that's not true." "So if we thought alike of Miss Bingley," replied Jane, "your representation of all this might make me quite easy, but I know the foundation is unjust. Caroline is incapable of wilfully deceiving anyone, and all that I can hope in this case is that she is deceived herself." So Jane is so silly. She's like, "Elizabeth, I know you already don't like Caroline Bingley, so that's why you're saying this about her." She's like, "But I know Caroline. She would never do that to me." Okay, Jane. "That is right. You could not have started a more happy idea, since you will not take comfort in mine. Believe her to be deceived by all means. You have now done your duty by her, and must fret no longer." "But, my dear sister, can I be happy, even supposing the best in accepting a man whose sisters and friends are all wishing him to marry elsewhere?" She's like, "Well, how can I marry him anyway? Nobody wants me there." "You must decide for yourself," said Elizabeth, "and if upon mature deliberation you find that the misery of disobliging his two sisters is more than equivalent to the happiness of being his wife, I advise you by all means to refuse him." She's like, "You care more about what his sisters think than about how you feel about Mr. Bingley?" She's like, "You must be out of your mind, girl." "How can you talk so?" said Jane, faintly smiling. "You must know that, though I should be exceedingly grieved at their disapprobation, I could not hesitate." She's like, "Oh no, I would still marry him." "I did not think you would, and that being the case, I cannot consider your situation with much compassion. But if he returns no more this winter, my choice will never be required. 1,000 things may arise in 6 months." The idea of his returning no more Elizabeth treated with the utmost contempt. It appeared to her merely the suggestion of Caroline's interested wishes, and she could not for a moment suppose that those wishes, however openly or artfully spoken, could influence a young man so totally independent of everyone. So Elizabeth's like, "Nah, I don't believe it. Not at all. She represented to her sister as forcibly as possible what she felt on the subject, and had soon the pleasure of seeing its happy effect. Jane's temper was not desponding, and she was gradually led to hope, though the diffidence of affection sometimes overcame the hope, that Bingley would return to Netherfield to answer every wish of her heart. So a part of her wanted to believe Elizabeth, so she's like, oh, okay, I don't feel so bad. You really think so, Elizabeth? You think he does love me? And so she wasn't feeling as terrible as maybe she did a little bit ago. They agreed that Mrs. Bennet should only hear of the departure of the family without being alarmed on the score of the gentleman's conduct. But even this partial communication gave her a great deal of concern, and she bewailed it as exceedingly unlucky that the ladies should happen to go away just as they were all getting so intimate together. After lamenting it, however, at some length, she had the consolation of thinking that Mr. Bingley would soon be down again and soon dining at Longbourn, and the conclusion of all was the comfortable declaration that, though he had been invited only to a family dinner, she would take care to have 2 full courses. So Mrs. Bennet did find out that they left, but I don't think they told her that it was going to be forever, according to Caroline. Chapter 22. The Bennets were engaged to dine with the Lucases, and again during the chief of the day was Miss Lucas so kind as to listen to Mr. Collins. Oh, so the Lucases came over, and Charlotte started that whole, favor thing where she took Mr. Collins's attention away from the family. She did it again, or she was doing it again. Elizabeth took an opportunity of thanking her. Oh, it keeps him in good humor, said she, and I am more obliged to you than I can express. Charlotte assured her friend of her satisfaction of being useful, and that it amply repaid her for the little sacrifice of her time. This was very amiable, but Charlotte's kindness extended further than Elizabeth had any conception of. Its object was nothing less than to secure her from any return of Mr. Collins's addresses by engaging them towards herself. Ah, so Charlotte wanted Mr. Collins to pay attention to her. Such was Miss Lucas's scheme, and appearances were so favorable that when they parted at night, she would have felt almost sure of success if he had not been to leave Hertfordshire so very soon. But here she did injustice to the fire and independence of his character, for it led him to escape out of Longbourn House the next morning with admirable shyness, and hasten to Lucas Lodge to throw himself at her feet. So the next day in the morning, he kind of snuck out, and he went to her house, to Charlotte's house, and threw himself at her, basically. He was anxious to avoid the notice of his cousins, from a conviction that if they saw him depart, they could not fail to conjecture his design, and he was not willing to have the attempt known till its success could be known likewise. For though feeling almost secure, and with reason, for Charlotte had been tolerably encouraging, he was comparatively diffident since the adventure of Wednesday. So Mr. Collins left, hoping that he would be successful in, I guess, getting Charlotte to like him, because, well, she was flirting with him the day before and the day before that. His reception, however, was of the most flattering kind. Miss Lucas perceived him from an upper window as he walked towards the house, and instantly set out to meet him accidentally in the lane. Ah! So Charlotte saw him walking down the road, and she's like, oh, I'm going to bump into him. Ooh, what the heck, Charlotte? But little had she dared to hope that so much love and eloquence awaited there. So she's like, oh, he likes me, very good. In as short a time as Mr. Collins's long speeches would allow, everything was settled between them to the satisfaction of both. Things were settled. Basically, they're going to get married. And as they entered the house, he earnestly entreated her to name the day that was to make him the happiest of men, and though such a solicitation must be waived for the present, the lady felt no inclination to trifle with his happiness. So basically, she said yes right away. She didn't feel like she had to tease him, like he thought Elizabeth was doing. The stupidity with which he was favored by nature must guard his courtship from any charm that could make a woman wish for its continuance. Miss Lucas, who accepted him solely from the pure and disinterested desire of an establishment, cared not how soon that establishment were gained. So Miss Lucas, she was just interested in getting married. That's it. She didn't really care about anything else. Sir William and Lady Lucas were speedily applied to for their consent, and it was bestowed with the most joyful alacrity. Mr. Collins's present circumstances made it a most eligible match for their daughter, to whom they could give little fortune. So they couldn't give her any money either, and they were like, great, she's getting married. And his prospects of future wealth were exceedingly fair. Lady Lucas began directly to calculate with more interest than the matter had ever excited before how many years longer Mr. Bennet was likely to live. Miss Lucas! She was basically like, I wonder how long Mr. Bennett's going to be, like, how long he's going to live, because once he dies, my daughter's going to have that house. And Sir William gave it as his decided opinion that whenever Mr. Collins should be in possession of the Longbourn estate, it would be highly expedient that both he and his wife should make their appearance at St. James's. The whole family, in short, were properly overjoyed on the occasion. The younger girls formed hopes of coming out a year or two sooner than they might otherwise have done, and the boys were relieved from their apprehension of Charlotte's dying an old maid. So even her brothers and sisters were like, thank goodness she's getting married. You know, Charlotte herself was tolerably composed. She had gained her point and had time to consider of it. Her reflections were in general satisfactory. Mr. Collins, to be sure, was neither sensible nor agreeable. His society was irksome, and his attachment to her must be imaginary. So Charlotte's not stupid. She knows he's annoying. He's neither sensible nor agreeable. You know, him thinking that he's in love with her must be all his imagination. She knows. She's not dumb. But still, he would be her husband. Without thinking highly either of men or of matrimony, marriage had always been her object. Oh, well, we knew that. Remember that chapter before, a few chapters ago, where Charlotte was saying, like, you just got to get married first, and then you can fall in love later. And Elizabeth was like, dude, you don't think that. Come on, Charlotte. I know you don't think that. But apparently she does. It was the only honorable provision for well-educated young women of small fortune, and however uncertain of giving happiness, must be their pleasantest preservative from want. This preservative she had now obtained. So basically, marriage is going to preserve her, because now she won't have to depend on her brothers. She won't die a spinster, you know. And at the age of 27, without having ever been handsome, she felt all the good luck of it. The least agreeable circumstance in the business was the surprise it must occasion to Elizabeth Bennet, whose friendship she valued beyond that of any other person. She's like, man, this is great. I'm 27. I'm not good looking. You know, I don't have any money. I'm going to get married. Great. She's like, but the only thing is that, you know, Elizabeth, you know, he asked her to get married just a few days ago, and now I'm going to marry that guy. You know, but we know that Charlotte really values Elizabeth's friendship. So Elizabeth would wonder and probably would blame her, and though her resolution was not to be shaken, her feelings must be hurt by such disapprobation. She resolved to give her the information herself, and therefore charged Mr. Collins, when he returned to Longbourn to dinner, to drop no hint of what had passed before any of the family. So Charlotte's like, no, I'm going to tell Elizabeth myself, Mr. Collins. Please don't tell her. I'll do it. A promise of secrecy was, of course, very dutifully given, but it could not be kept without difficulty, for the curiosity excited by his long absence burst forth in such very direct questions on his return as required some ingenuity to evade. And he was at the same time exercising great self-denial, for he was longing to publish his prosperous love. So he's like, okay, fine, I'll keep your secret. I won't tell anybody. But when he got to Longbourn, they're like, where were you? What were you doing? And of course, he's excited and he wants to tell people, you know, about his engagement, but he's keeping the secret, but it's hard. As he was to begin his journey too early on the morrow to see any of the family, the ceremony of leave-taking was performed when the ladies moved for the night, and Mrs. Bennet, with great politeness and cordiality, said how happy she should be to see him at Longbourn again, whenever his other engagements might allow him to visit them. My dear madam, he replied, this invitation is particularly gratifying, because it is what I have been hoping to receive, and you may be very certain that I shall avail myself of it as soon as possible. And he's like, oh, great, you're inviting me back? Perfect, I'll come. And we know why, because he wants to see Charlotte. They were all astonished, and Mr. Bennet, who could by no means wish for so speedy a return, immediately said, "But is there not danger of Lady Catherine's disapprobation here, my good sir? You had better neglect your relations than run the risk of offending your patroness." He's like, "What? No, it's better to offend us than to offend Lady Catherine. No, 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 you don't need to come back." "My dear sir," replied Mr. Collins, "I am particularly obliged to you for this friendly caution, and you may depend upon my not taking so material a step without her ladyship's concurrence. You cannot be too much on your guard. Risk anything rather than her displeasure, and if you find it likely to be raised by your coming to us again, which I should think exceedingly probable, stay quietly at home and be satisfied that we shall take no offense." He's like, "No, no, no." Mr. Bennet's like, "No, no, no. If you think you might offend Mrs. Lady Catherine de Bourgh, then you don't need to come. Don't come." He's like, "We're not going to be offended, I promise. Believe me, my dear sir, my gratitude is warmly excited by such affectionate attention, and depend upon it, you will speedily receive from me a letter of thanks for this, as well as for every other mark of your regard during my stay in Hertfordshire. As for my fair cousins, though my absence may not be long enough to render it necessary, I shall now take the liberty of wishing them health and happiness, not excepting my cousin Elizabeth." So he's like, "No, I wish everybody happiness, all of them, even Elizabeth." With proper civilities, the ladies then withdrew, all of them equally surprised to find that he meditated a quick return. Mrs. Bennet wished to understand by it that he thought of paying his addresses to one of her younger girls, and Mary might have been prevailed on to accept him. She's like, "Oh, well, maybe he's coming back so he can marry one of the other sisters. Yay!" She rated his abilities much higher than any of the others. There was a solidarity in his reflections which often struck her, and though by no means so clever as herself, she thought that if encouraged to read and improve himself by such an example as hers, he might become a very agreeable companion. She's talking about like with Mary. But on the following morning, every hope of this kind was done away. Miss Lucas called soon after breakfast, and was in a private conference with Elizabeth, related the event of the day before. So here comes Charlotte Lucas to tell Elizabeth, "Hey, I'm going to marry Mr. Collins." The possibility of Mr. Collins's fancying himself in love with her friend had once occurred to Elizabeth within the last day or two. So Elizabeth was like, I thought maybe he might be in love with Charlotte, but nah. But that Charlotte could encourage him seemed almost as far from possibility as that she could encourage him herself. And her astonishment was consequently so great as to overcome at first the bounds of decorum, and she could not help crying out, "Engaged to Mr. Collins, my dear Charlotte, impossible!" So Elizabeth's like, "What?" And it says there that she was so shocked by Charlotte's behavior that she just lost all sense of decorum, and she was like, "What in the world?" It's almost like saying, "What the F?" To her. Sorry, I know that's not a nice thing to say. But anyway, the steady countenance which Miss Lucas had commanded in telling her story gave way to a momentary confusion here on receiving so direct a reproach. Charlotte's like, "Oh, crap, she's talking to me like that?" Though, as it was no more than she expected, she soon regained her composure and calmly replied, "Why should you be surprised, my dear Eliza? Do you think it incredible that Mr. Collins should be able to procure any woman's good opinion because he was not so happy as to succeed with you? But Elizabeth had now recollected herself, and making a strong effort for it, was able to assure her with tolerable firmness that the prospect of their relationship was highly grateful to her, and that she wished her all imaginable happiness. "I see what you're feeling," replied Charlotte. "You must be surprised, very much surprised, so lately as Mr. Collins was wishing to marry you." She's like, "I know you're surprised because he had just proposed to you, and now he's with me. But when you have had time to think it over, I hope you will be satisfied with what I have done. I am not romantic, you know. I never was. I ask only a comfortable home. And considering Mr. Collins's character, connections, and situation in life, I am convinced that my chance of happiness with him is as fair as most people can boast on entering the marriage state." She's like, "No. I mean, because of who he is and where he is and his job and all that, I think I might be happy with him. I have a good enough chance, just like everybody else has a chance. I have the same chance." Elizabeth quietly answered, "Undoubtedly." And after an awkward pause, they returned to the rest of the family. "Oh, Elizabeth, just support your friend, dude. I get it. Ugh, but still. Charlotte did not stay much longer, and Elizabeth was then left to reflect on what she had heard. It was a long time before she became at all reconciled to the idea of so unsuitable a match. The strangeness of Mr. Collins's making two offers of marriage within 3 days was nothing in comparison of his being now accepted. She's like, I thought it was crazy. She's like, I think it's crazy that Mr. Collins can offer two different women uh, marriage. But what's even crazier is that somebody accepted him, and it was Charlotte. Which is crazy because if you think about it, um, Elizabeth and Charlotte are best friends. I mean, in order to be best friends with somebody, you would have to understand them, um, know everything about them, and it's like Elizabeth knowing what she thought to be true about Charlotte is not true, or maybe she just wasn't paying attention. I mean, Charlotte was playing with her, saying, not playing, but she told her simply, like, yeah, no, marriage is important. You may not be happy when you get married. Oh well. And what did she say? You need to know as little of the defects of the person you're about to marry. Okay. I mean, that's Charlotte's way of thinking. I mean, Elizabeth, what, she thought she was kidding? Maybe she did. Anyway, she had always felt that Charlotte's opinion of matrimony was not exactly like her own, but she could not have supposed it possible that when called into action, she would have sacrificed every better feeling to worldly advantage. Charlotte, the wife of Mr. Collins, was a most humiliating picture, and to the pang of a friend disgracing herself and sunk in her esteem was added the distressing conviction that it was impossible for that friend to be tolerably happy in the lot she had chosen.